Hi, my name is Dragon, and I'm joined by Lucy today for my Keystone, More Than Just a Game, Understanding the Effects of Gaming on Mental Health. And we are going to do a bit of a deep dive into her relationship with video games and their impact on her life. Lucy, if you could just get us started by introducing yourself, and I guess the relationship you've had with video games growing up or more recently.
I'm Lucy. I am a double major in philosophy and psych, and I've been interested in video games played a really central part in my life since I was really young. Like when I was like at the earliest memories I have are like probably like 4 years old, where I'm like sitting on our super gross shag carpeting in Portland, Oregon, um, watching on our, like, we had this black and white, like, super tiny box TV ones, the ones that like go all the way out the back,
Oh
like
yeah,
they're like
okay.
these big bricks. We had one of those, and we would play Super Smash Melee on that. And I was too young, but I remember they would give me the controller and they wouldn't plug it in, and I would just think that I was so sick. I was like, I am killing it. I am absolutely so good at this game. Um, and then that was just like it was mostly because my dad was into video games and still
Mm,
is, and so that was like our TV and movies was like we would sit down, and usually the older siblings would play some video game that just came out on whatever console we had at the time, and we just watch it. um and so it like is was a really big part of that for me. And then um like I just sit down and like watch my brother and sister play Wind Waker and take turns playing it, and then like try and see if I could get in like 30 minutes of playing it myself between
mhm.
that. And then as I got older, I kind of lost that relationship a little bit when I was in high school. Um, and then when I was going through like a really bad mental health crisis in like probably junior year of high school, my little sister, who's 2 years younger than me, she was really there for me, and we got really close. We're still super close now, but um, that's like when we got really, really close again.
Mhm.
And she was, she's in comp sci now. Like she was always into like video games and computers and all that kind of stuff. And uh, she really got me back into it. And then I just never looked back. Like I just reconnected with that thing that I had in my childhood and saw how much it evolved from what it was when I was little, and how much my tastes evolved for different
Mm.
games. And yeah, it kind of reignited that love for video games in me. Yeah.
That's really wholesome. I mean,
Yeah, it is.
that
It is pretty wholesome.
I guess just for some for some clarification, um, how big is your family? It sounds like
Oh
you've got a lot
God.
of siblings.
Yeah. Okay. I have to think about it. Which you already know it's gonna
That
be big because I got to think about it. So I have two step siblings now, but I didn't at the time. Um, but they're there. Just like put them somewhere in your brain, but not at the time when I was telling this story. And then I've got my youngest brother, Boris, who was born when I was 5.
hmm
I've got Leo, who is my older brother, Maud, who is my older sister, older than Leo. Leo's 3 years older than me, Maud's 5 years older than me. And then I've got my younger sister, Nellie. So that's Boris, Leo, Maud, Nellie, that's 4. Plus me, and then the two step siblings, that makes 7.
It's a big family.
7 including myself, 6 without. Yeah, but at that time it was just at the when I first started playing video games, it would have Boris probably wouldn't have been involved much. He was a baby.
Right.
But he got in there later on.
So it sounds like video games is kind of it almost seems like a family tradition at this point.
Yeah, it was not as much like at my mom's house. It wasn't really involved as much with like my parents, but at my dad's house, it was my dad and all of us. Like we would do that after dinner, like every single night. We would play video games, um, and he really loved playing them, and we all really loved playing them, and I didn't get to play them as much when I was younger. I mostly
Right.
just watched them. And honestly, I think that is what kind of drew me more towards story-based games like later in life, because like I grew up watching games instead of really like engaging with them. And now I'm like, I do play like a very large variety of video games, but the games that really hit me hardest are usually very story rich games. And I think that's mainly it, is because like I would watch Wind Waker and that'd be like a movie, and it'd be
Mm.
like my siblings playing it and I'd get to like experience it through that. And it was always this very magical thing of getting to explore like these different worlds.
Well, let's do a deeper dive into that. As you just briefly mentioned, you have a very wide range of video games. And, in the gaming
Yeah,
world, there are a lot of different games you can play.
there are.
So, why storytelling games? Like, what specific games do you enjoy playing, and why that specific genre?
Yeah. So, like again, like I've played a ton of different games. My Steam library is overflowing. I've got a huge backlog of games that I really want to play too. But um the games that like come to mind when I think of like my favorite games are, I think, like from big names, like probably Breath of the Wild would definitely be up
Mm,
there. Because that's like partially because it's connecting all the way back to like my favorite games when I was a kid, which were Wind Waker, Twilight Princess,
right.
Majora's Mask. I was Our whole family, but like especially me, I was really into Legend of Zelda. That was like my big thing. I just thought it was such a beautiful, amazing world, and it was just so magical.
Mm,
And then also like I do also really like games that focus on mental health. So like Celeste, even though that would be more a traditional platformer, like it has that real story there. And that's like the big thing for me, is like I'll play any real genre of game, but story is a really important aspect of it, unless it's multiplayer, and then I'll play anything because that's more social. But if I'm playing a game alone, like uh I'll play anything as long as there's a story. So like Celeste really hit me hard. I recently played Amori and I
mm.
cried so much, so often. My boyfriend was like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine. I promise. I'm fine. It's just these little characters. They're going through a lot of things." Um, and like Night in the Woods, like Fran Bow, like a lot of indie games I've been super into. But then like also some ones that just have really fun memories with my sister. Like we would always play Portal 2 together.
Mm,
So that was like a really big one for me, and we would get really into like all the lore and like world building. Even though it's like such a short game, like
right.
we get super into it. We're like, "Oh, who is Val? Who is this person? Like what? Oh my god, like what is the lore behind this? Like how did Gladys become how she is?
Mm,
Like who's Carolyn?" Like all this stuff. We'd get super into that. I played Undertale with her, so I was really into that. um I played Papers, Please with her, which is really fun. So like a lot of games that I either watched her play or we played together, or we would like take turns playing, I really loved, just because like it kind of brought me back to that, and also it helped me grow even closer to my sister,
mm-hmm.
who I still play video games with all the time.
So that's a lot of information. There was a lot of things I want to talk about.
Hmm.
We're gonna, I think we're a bit warmed up okay already. So we're gonna kind of dive really deep. So I know you
Okay.
talked about a little bit about your mental health crisis in junior year,
Yeah.
and then you've mentioned your younger sister a lot. It sounds like she's a really good support system for you. But alongside your sister, there's video games. So I guess if you're comfortable in sharing, could you talk a little bit about what happened your junior year, and then how your sister and video
Yeah.
games kind of brought you back out of it?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much I'm allowed to discuss, but um, they're basically like, so probably because of things that I know now, having been diagnosed with bipolar 2 now,
Mm-hmm.
um, I was very impulsive all throughout my childhood, and also, like really impulsive in high school. I did like a lot of really bad stuff.
It happens.
I kind of ran with the wrong crowd.
Mm,
And so there was like some drug stuff involved, and basically like I started getting these horrible panic attacks that would last. They were atypical, so they would last 8 hours, and they were much more kind of akin to almost like an acid trip than they were like anything that like a normal panic attack would be like.
mm-hmm.
So it was really scary, and I was, really freaked out. I couldn't go to school. I couldn't interact with people. None of my friends really understood that much because they had mental health problems, but not really to the same degree that I did. Um, but my family, all of them have a history with a lot of different mental health issues, so they really understood. And I got really close to my mom and really close to my sister. My mom, just because she had the same experience as me, which was that, like weed was kind of a catalyst for her panic disorder, and that's what happened with me. And so like I stopped doing everything. And that kind of disconnected me with my friends a little bit in junior year because I couldn't hang out with them in the same way that I was used to, just because
Right.
I couldn't be around a lot of these things that were very triggering for me um, at that time. And I was so afraid like of leaving my house. Like if I left, I would just have an 8-hour panic attack and I would go back to square one.
Right.
So because I was like just in the beginning of trying to figure out my mental health, I was home a lot. And uh, my sister was also home a lot because had she still has, I mean, a chronic disorder. Um, she has POTS and AMPS, which is amplified musculoskeletal pain disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's like post orthostatic something for POTS. But they all fall under this umbrella of, autoimmune disorders that affect the, nervous system and the circuits in your brain that respond to pain. They're kind of similar to fibromyalgia.
Mm,
So she was having a flare up during that time, which lasted about a year. So she was just always home. And
right.
so because she was always home, and I was always home because of what I was dealing with, we both kind of connected. And we also connected just because we felt, like these things had happened to us that had made us have to become disconnected from people that we really wanted to see and hang out with.
Mm-hmm.
And she also was going through some mental health stuff with like having to be home all the time and not knowing if her condition was going to get better, which thank God it is. It's
Mm.
completely manageable now. But so that was like really tough for her, and so we kind of bonded over that. And yeah.
So it sounds like both of you went through a lot during that time period.
Yeah, we definitely did. But like I think that just like having each other was such a big deal during that time.
Right. And it sounds like the big thing for both of you was kind of being isolated from the outside world, you with your friends because you couldn't hang out in the same way, her
Hmm.
because she had pain going outside. So I guess, how did video games come into play there?
Yeah, I mean, she was already into them, and like had been for a while, and uh, I, kind of like was just hanging out with her all the time, and she was introducing me to this world of video games that I didn't know existed because I only knew what I knew from my childhood, which like
Right.
goes all the way up to like I probably stopped playing video games as much around like Left 4 Dead 2 kind of era. Um, I played a little bit of Black Ops, but like that was about the time, like probably middle school was about the
Mm,
time that I stopped playing video games as much. And then she introduced me, the first game I think she introduced me to was Papers, Please. And I just was like, this is so cool. Like, I didn't know that they made like video games on topics like this, like that there was something that like there was something amazing about like these games that weren't made by these big developers that could talk about issues and explore different stories that wouldn't really be able to be sold mass market by a big
right.
developer, and that was just super cool and amazing to me. And they were also short, and I was able to play them really quickly, and so we could like play them and then talk about them for hours,
Mm,
and we could play games together. And that was just like, I also think part of it was that it was kind of going back to how we felt when we were kids, and being able to like have that comfort during that time was such a big deal. And it's still such a huge part of my life and like my identity now, and kind of like changed me, and like made me a completely different person, both my mental health and getting into video games and being introduced to friend groups that I wouldn't have entered if, I didn't meet them through video games.
Again, a lot of things I want to talk about. I'll try to keep us on track.
Yeah,
Um,
I told you beforehand. I told you I tend to talk a lot.
no, this is good. It's just I guess there are a lot of different topics that are in my head that I want to like. I think that are all worth exploring.
Yeah. Well, I'm
But
an open book.
I appreciate that. The first one, I guess, you just mentioned is that like gaming made you a completely different person. And so usually
Mhm.
in the media, you see how gaming is generally bad for people's characters. It makes you that,
Yeah,
in air quotes,
I
your
don't
classic
know.
nerd, your classic, basement dweller,
I
Cheetos,
don't think
Mountain
there's
Dew.
anything bad about being a nerd, but I I totally kind of disagree with that stereotype, because like there is some truth to the fact that it can make you a little bit more isolated. Like I have seen that with some people, but not necessarily more so than if they were doing something else. I don't think
Mm,
I've never seen it where like video games was the catalyst to them being isolated. I've seen people be isolated while playing video games when they usually would be isolated for other reasons as well. Like it's kind of
right.
like they isolate themselves and then they're playing video games a lot, but it's not something I ever see that's like, oh, they started playing video games and then they stopped talking to everyone.
Mm,
Um, I usually see it in a much more social way. Like everyone I've met that is really big into video games, it's become like such a social outlet for them where they can, like go on multiplayer and, play with all of these different people from different places and like make friends that they might not have been able to make in real life, or, meet people with all of these different uh, common interests that
mm,
they also have. I don't think it's, that much different than just finding any kind of community that accepts you and is able to kind of let you into that. And like the gaming community can be a little bit toxic at times, that's for sure. But at the end of the day, people in that community are individuals, and I've
mm,
met some of my best friends like online through video games. So you know, like I have my friend group that's in real life that I hang out with, and some of them are also play video games, and I play video games with them. And then I like play video games with people online. And also I probably wouldn't be able to hang out with my sister as much if it weren't for video games, because I, you know, hop online, and we recently have been playing Borderlands 3.
Mm.
So we've been playing a lot of that, and I'll play that with her and like some of my friends and some of her friends, and all of us are just together. And we're able to like interact from thousands of miles away, and it's much more of an interactive like medium to be able to do that, where you're like really working together, and it's like you can really still feel like you're super connected to that person, rather than just FaceTiming them where you're having that conversation but you don't feel as much like they're in the room with you. And
Mm.
to me, when you're like playing a video game with someone, you feel really close to that
Mm.
person.
So usually gamers play video games as a hobby. Like it's just something to pass the time. Um, but for you, it almost sounds like you've taken it to the next level. It's a social
Yeah, I
communication
guess.
tool for you. It builds community. It's a way for you to
Yeah.
like connect with your family and meet new people online. So it really sounds like you harness the power of video games to be your own.
Yeah, I definitely, I don't know if I take it to the extreme, but like I just see it in a very different way maybe than a lot of people, just because like I think honestly, like when I get into anything, I very much get into it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I'm either all in or I'm not.
Mm.
And I think that like I just, when I got reintroduced to video games, like I just found so many things that were able to say things about myself that I wasn't able to at the time. Like, you know, Night in the Woods or Amori or those kind of games where it's like really introspective.
Mm.
And I grew such a love for that medium where it's, because it's different from anything else. Like you can tell a story where you're a part of it. You feel like you're in that story. You feel like you're genuinely involved in all of the emotions that these characters have, and you're very
Right.
connected to them. I think it's very different from reading a book or watching a movie or watching a TV show. I think it kind of harnesses the best, at its best, it harnesses the best aspects of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that that is such an amazing thing. Um, and the fact that you can experience that with other people is just like an amazing bonus.
Okay. To be honest, you've talked a lot about you've named a lot of different video games. I'm nodding my head. I don't know half of them. I'm
Yeah,
a
they are smaller games. I play some big titles too, but I play a lot of smaller games because I'm just thinking about the games that I play when it's just me, and that's
Mhm.
definitely like games that are much smaller. Amori just came out recently. You should definitely check that one out. It's super super good.
We're not
Like
sponsored, but if we are,
amazing.
Amori, you've heard
Amori, hit us up.
it.
Hit
No,
us up.
so the point I wanted to kind of make was I'm a pretty basic gamer. I play a lot of League.
Hmm.
Probably too much League. But as someone who's like really into indie games, and as someone who's done, I guess you've talked a lot about games like Celeste, like games that kind of dive
I'm hoping you
deeper.
can't hear the construction happening.
I cannot. You're
Hoping
okay.
that's not okay. Good, because there's a
um,
lot of construction in the building.
but like as a basic gamer, I usually expect video games to be like League, where it's just kind of for fun. You might play with some other people, you run some stuff, and
Yeah,
then it's in and done. But you've played so many games that have really, I guess, helped you grow as a person or understand yourself a lot
yeah.
better. So I guess can you do it for me and for the audience? Can you
Mhm.
explain a bit more about what that indie genre is like, what the storytelling things
Yeah.
are, and games like Celeste, like what impact they've had on you and what impact you think those games have on other people?
So, like with indie games, it's usually like maybe two, three people on a team. Like it's small. It's small. And I mean, with Undertale, it was just one guy, Toby Fox.
Mm.
Um, and there are like I feel like the indie genre of video games is kind of like the indie genre of music, in that like technically it's a genre, but it's really like there's so many different things that fall under that. The ones that I'm more specifically talking about are like story rich indie games that usually come in the form of like an RPG.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like with Celeste, it's that one is a platformer, and so it's much more like strategic. And that was like, at the time I played it, that was kind of hard for me because I hadn't played a ton of platformers in that time, and I was like, oh, it's a hard game.
It is a hard game.
It is a hard game. But the story, like that kept me going through it, and it's just this amazing story of kind of like being your worst enemy and being able to overcome mental health problems, not overcome them, but learn to live with them. Because like that's kind of the whole message of it, is like that thing that you see as your worst enemy can be there with you and be a part of you and not completely overtake your entire person. And it's not something you need to vilify. And if you do vilify it, it kind of like makes it worse because you're treating it like this thing that is gonna take over your life.
Right.
And I think that's a really beautiful and nuanced way to look at mental health. And it's all kind of packaged in this idea of climbing a mountain, which is a pretty straightforward metaphor, but
Yeah.
it's a good one, especially for a platformer. It's a great idea. And then there's all these different like worlds in it that are like, you know, where you're in the hotel and you're in the different areas that are super cool.
Yeah, I think one of the special things about video games is how many video games there are. So you have
Yeah,
single player,
especially now.
multiplayer. Yeah, especially now. Um, so I don't know. I think it's one of the things where it seems like you kind of figure out what game speaks to you and how to understand those games and, you know, really understand the video game in the context of yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty hard for a lot of people to understand, especially when you get into like video games. You kind of play mindlessly sometimes. You just get absorbed by whatever you're doing,
Yeah.
and you just don't think about it. So how did you make that change? Like, how did you become so self-aware and cognizant of what the metaphors of a video game might be?
I think when I first started, I think it was because like I was analyzing them with my sister. It was like a pastime of us to like really dive deep into them. And also because like when I get into anything, I just want to know everything about it. And so the more there is to a game to know, the more I'm going to. Like with Breath of the Wild, I was like full in. I have the whole like giant book of how they made the game with like all of the different facts about the different locations and all that kind of stuff. And like, so I get really into it once I'm into it. And I think like with the games that I'm talking about that I play myself, um, they're like just really powerful tools for talking about mental health, and they aren't afraid to say that like openly. Like with Fran Bow, that one is a little bit, it's technically a horror game, but there's also like really beautiful, amazing moments. Same with Amori. And like amazing, fantastic worlds. And so like they very openly like show you that message of about that this game is about mental health. This game is about these different conditions or these different things that people may be struggling with. Like with Amori, there's just like one of the central themes of the game is the idea of getting older, the idea of feeling like you kind of want, feeling a longing to kind of revert back to the amazing like fantasy and imagination of childhood, and seeing your friends get older and losing touch with people and all of that stuff. There's such adult themes, but they're packaged in these beautiful, like, fantastical worlds that you can really escape into.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like for me, you're escaping into these worlds, but you're still like able to look inward and look at yourself and grow during that experience. And I think you can do that really with any game, like, especially if it's a game that's social. Like, I mean, there is a ton of like games where it's just mindless and it's just strategy, you
Mm.
know, like when I play Borderlands 3, I'm not like, oh wow, I really need to know the inner workings of all these people's brains.
Right.
But I am growing through the fact that I'm getting better at it. I feel like I'm growing. I feel like I'm succeeding. I feel like I'm good at it. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I'm connecting with the people that I'm playing with, because it's such an immensely, it's the game is focused completely on multiplayer. And I think like that aspect of it is just super cool. And there is a story there if you want it. um you know, I don't, it's more to the side than other games that I play, but it is there. Same with Portal 2. Like, you can play that simply as a strategy game, or you can get really into the history of like where that world came from
Mm.
and what there is, because there's all the, you know, like web comics and stuff that the creator made. And so you could go super deep into it, or you, like, I think the interaction is completely based on how much you want to interact with it. And I think that makes it a really good like medium for anything, is that like you get to choose how you want to interact with it. Like, ultimately it's your decision, and that's a very powerful one in my opinion.
So, as a psych major, and both myself and yourself,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna play a little bit of devil's advocate here, even though I don't know if that's actually good for my purpose, my hypothesis. So, you've talked a lot about how you can kind of escape into a world. You can really put yourself, like, immerse yourself into a different game, and you feel yourself growing, achieving things, and whatnot. And in a sense, that's a lot easier than real life. You know, real life, you have to face
Yeah.
struggles and whatnot. And, you know, sometimes I personally don't think video games are addictive. I think there's a lot of addictive qualities, but I think it's more like, as you said earlier, video games aren't a catalyst for someone to become isolated. They're isolated and they turn to video games as like
Yeah.
their means of coping.
Mm-hmm.
So in this sense, finding that sense of achievement, finding the sense of growth in a video game rather than real life can not be
Yeah.
great. So I
Yeah.
guess as someone who seems to have found a pretty good solid balance on like understanding yourself, understanding the game, but also interacting with things in real life, how do you find that balance? And do you see the risks of those sorts of video games, like really just closing you into a video game instead of being able to expand into the entire world?
I do, and I've had my own personal struggles with it. Like, with Breath of the Wild, I would be up until like 4 a.m. because I wouldn't want to stop playing it. And I would be putting off work. And I
Mm,
don't do that anymore, but I think it is something, I think it's like with anything, like binge watching a TV show or like anything that you do during your free time, you need to figure out whether or not that's serving you, whether or not you are using that responsibly, whether or not that is something where that is isolating you, or something that is allowing you the space to breathe a little bit from
right.
the stuff that you deal with in your everyday life, like whether you're shutting it out or giving yourself just a break. um, and I think that's something that you can struggle with anything. I think it is particularly hard with video games because they're so immersive,
Mm,
but I think there is definitely a balance there that can be struck. And I think like now there are also, you know, more outlets for people to be able to integrate video games into their, you know, actual lives. I mean, like, you could grow up wanting to be a Twitch streamer, you know, like you could do that if you wanted. Um, so there's like, I think because of the internet, like you could really like use that love of video games to actually help you succeed in the real world if you wanted to.
Mm,
And I've met a lot of people who their love of video games have led them to become game devs,
mm-hmm.
um, or game designers. And so, you know, there's so much opportunity to be able to create from that love. And it's not necessarily something that if you want to, you need to treat as a hobby. As long as you're willing to work for it, you can, you know, make that a part of your actual life if you want to. For me, it is a hobby, but I think that it's something that, like, while it has the potential to be addicting, and it can be addicting, like, even you know, for me, having played all these years and knowing kind of what that balance is, I think that, you know, everybody can, like, it's not something that makes someone play
Mm,
irresponsibly. I think that it's kind of like what a little bit what you said, kind of a coping mechanism, and it's how you use that coping mechanism and whether you know it's a coping mechanism, because that's something that you just need to be able to face yourself.
right. We're gonna switch gears a little bit. Again, there's a lot of things I want to talk about. I don't think we're gonna have time. That's okay. Um, you've just briefly mentioned, I guess, making video games into a career. I'm not sure exactly how much you know about the esports gaming industry as it is now.
I know a good amount.
Do you want to explain to the audience, like, I guess that the change the video game esports industry is going? I
I
guess
mean,
more generally, the large jobs you can take, whether that's a professional gamer, game
yeah, I
dev, all
mean,
these
like,
things.
now it really is a viable career option. Like, if you're good at video games, you can make good money at these tournaments. And but the thing is that it does scare me a little bit, because from what I've seen, there have been, like, it's it's something where whenever, like, something that I think is amazing and beautiful and creative becomes monetized so heavily in that way. I mean,
Mm,
video games are always monetized, but in the way of, like, where the, like, act of just, like, playing a video game becomes this monetary thing, it does sometimes scare me about, like, where that's heading. And I think that
mm,
there have been a lot of people who play video games full time that speak out about, like, the stress and pressure of that, of how that kind of is not really, you know, a hobby anymore. So I wouldn't want, like, people going into that because they, you know, think that they're just going to be playing video games all the time,
mm-hmm,
because, you know, like, it is a job. But, like, it, the way that esports are now, it is kind of crazy how big they are. um I think that the culture around them is interesting. um
yeah, it's
there can
understandable.
be, like, I think that there is some, as with any sport, there's some toxicity
Mm-hmm,
that can enter. I think that there's a pretty big gender gap that definitely needs to be addressed.
for sure.
um and the way that women are treated in, like, that world definitely needs to be fixed. But other than that, i I see it as a good thing, you know, like, it's creating more viable career options for people that love video games and want to make that their career. And I think that if you're really good at a video game, that's a skill, that's a talent. And I think thinking of that as something other than that, like, thinking of that as somehow different than other things that you could be insanely good at, is
Mm,
a weird concept to me, because some people do feel that way, that, like, oh, but it's video games. I'm like, well, are you as good at video games as that person? Because
right.
they're insane, like, they've dedicated their lives to being insanely good at this, and that's amazing.
Mm-hmm. The one big thing you mentioned there, completely unrelated from the video game esports. Oh, it's not. In your email you sent to me back when I was trying to look for people who to speak on the podcast,
Hmm.
I remember you specifically mentioned that you were a female, and you just brought up how the toxicity towards women in the esports and video game industry is relatively rampant. I think a lot of it's actually still kept undertones. I know we had the Me Too movement, especially in the video game industry, like this past summer.
Yeah.
So as a woman who plays video games and all these things, like how has that affected you? Have people
Yeah.
been toxic towards you? Like, what has your experience been like?
I think like the thing is that there's always this kind of like, especially in multiplayer competitive games, there's always this kind of like back and forth competitive kind of like shit talking. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's always going to exist, and that's something I actually really like about it. Like that's, I think that that's totally fine. It's all in good fun. I think that people tend to feel like the comments that are made towards women in things like online lobbies are just the same as that. But
Mm-hmm.
like as someone who has witnessed both sides of that, like my boyfriend when he hops on, like there's some like comments like oh, get good, bro, like that kind of stuff. But there's, you know, like some mom jokes, that kind of thing, but there's nothing directly at that person and their identity, you know? It's never like oh, you're a dude, like so you suck. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like I feel like if I was able to hop onto, you know, like COD and get in a lobby and have it be where it's just like that kind of jabbing, I would think that was super fun. You know, like I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But like every time that I've ever gotten into a lobby, it's always about the fact that I'm a girl.
Mm-hmm.
And that's different for different games. So like I play online on Dead by Daylight a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I've never experienced in that. Phantasmophobia, never experienced it in that. Anything that's like more team based and less competitive, or like really shooters is where I see that the most prevalently,
Mm-hmm.
where I just am like, oh well, I guess I just can't use my mic.
Right.
um but like with that kind of stuff, it's like there's poking fun, but there's never anything about me being a girl. And I think
Mm-hmm.
like that's the difference that needs to be changed, is like that, because the thing is that I feel like girls are so underrepresented in that, even though I feel like there is a good amount of the population that are girls that either want to play video games or do, and they just don't get on, they just don't go online. Like
Mm-hmm.
they don't turn their mic on, they don't actually like, they don't get drawn to those games that they might end up loving, like something like COD, or you know, like they don't do that because they know how harmful it can be to them and to their mental health. And I think that's kind of sad. Like I think it's really sad. So I think that that's something that really needs to change, because I think that as a whole, the gaming community has been moving more towards being inclusive, but not really as fast as other communities have.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that there's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on in the gaming community, and like because we don't really push video games towards girls when they're younger, like I think that they get scared of entering a community that feels so gated,
Right.
and then they're not as represented, and then it becomes a dude thing where, you know, there is actually a lot of that like kind of hatred towards people that come in, and I think
Mm.
that that really needs to change.
The way you put it almost sounds like there's so being a girl trying to get into video games, already that stigma, the stereotype that video games are meant for guys, and obviously being a nerd is still not necessarily something that people look towards. But then once you
Yeah.
get inside, I guess, the video game scene, if you're brave enough to take that first step, there's that second wave of barriers you have to face of like guys being toxic.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of sexism. There's a lot of creepy flirting online too. So like it's just a
Yeah.
lot of things have to change in
Like
order for
Discord and that kind of stuff. Like
yeah,
of like, hop in VC, like that
yeah.
kind of stuff. That's definitely like a problem. Um, I think, but I think that like it's not like in some areas of the gaming community, it's not as prevalent as people make it out to be. Like and then in others, it's more prevalent than people make it out to be.
Mm,
Because I think it really depends on the game that you're playing, because different people are attracted to different games. And if you're getting on a shooter, there's going to be a lot of 12-year-olds saying horrible shit to you.
yeah.
And um, I think that that's just like a cultural thing that we need to change about like the way that we treat people in those spaces. Because it shouldn't be that a girl is only allowed to play certain genres of a game because they're afraid of the backlash that they'll get. And then like being a nerd, I don't know, like I think that's a thing that people should own more than they do. You
Mm,
know, like I love the fact that like there are people that are that passionate about things,
mm-hmm.
you know, and I think that that's kind of all being a nerd is being super passionate about something. And I think that people who are super passionate about football are super nerdy.
Mm-hmm.
They're nerdy about football, you know, like they play like fantasy football and that's basically the same thing.
Mm,
um and so I think that that kind of stigma is getting a lot better. Like, I don't get the same reaction telling guys that I play video games as I did probably even a few years ago. Like, it's not something that's as weird anymore. And I think that's a little bit because of the rise of Twitch, because there are a lot of like female streamers on there. And I mean, there's definitely like stereotypes about like them being really sexualized and that kind of
yeah.
stuff. But like, I think it has shown people that you can be a girl and play video games that might not have like put that into their brain. And there's still like stereotypes about it, about like, oh, like you're a gamer girl that's gonna show their boobs on your webcam or something. Which, one, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to do. And two, like there's like that idea that girls play video games because it's like they're looking for male attention that kind of like
Mm,
exists, is a very weird one, because why would you get super into something that's so time consuming and takes a lot of skill and effort to like get the attention of a dude
right.
when it's honestly very easy to get the attention of guys. Like, it's, you don't need to go to that length.
I'm gonna throw
So
share
that
dress like that.
stereotype is really weird to
Mm,
me, you know? But it is one that definitely exists about like gamer girls, like and e-girls and all of these
right.
kind of things that these labels that we give to girls in those communities that we wouldn't give to guys. We wouldn't be like, oh, you just are playing video games because you want to be hot. What? That would never be
Mm,
said to a dude. Like,
right.
so it's is interesting.
I guess so we've talked a lot about stigma. We've talked a lot about how social media and people like the culture behind video games. As a psych major, let me preface: have you seen a therapist for, I guess, mental health, or is that something
Oh
you haven't
yeah.
done yet?
I see a therapist and I see a psychiatrist as well.
I guess what's your take on the mental health profession with video games? Because as we know, a lot of, I guess, mental health professionals tend to be on the older side. They grew up in a generation that
Yeah.
didn't exist within video games, and a lot of times they're either against it or remain kind of ignorant against it. Um,
Yeah. I think they treat it kind of like it's a drug. There's a lot of people that treat it that way. I have the privilege of having a therapist that's very pro it. Like, he's totally cool with it. He thinks that it's a great thing in my life, but as long as I'm, doing it in a responsible way. But like, I think that definitely is something where there is this kind of misunderstanding around it because it is a newer media. You wouldn't really say that about TV or books,
Right.
or all of those other things, which you can become just as addicted to.
Sure.
And I also think that there is a aspect of the way that video games are, how immersive they are, that could be used to benefit the psychological field. Like, I think there are some, strides being made in, cognitive psychology of making games that do things like help children with ADHD, or and I think like that could be an entire like field of psychology, of making interactive mediums that, like video games, that are able to treat people with mental health issues, which it could be a huge deal because that kind of thing, a lot of people don't have access to a therapist, or they're afraid of the stigma of going to a therapist, or they don't want to tell their parents they want to go to a therapist,
Right.
or any of those different things. And like, having something available that could effectively, and has been studied and peer reviewed and all of those things, effectively treat certain conditions or help people cope with those conditions, is a really powerful tool that I don't think that people consider enough.
It's interesting you bring that up. I don't think anywhere within the Google form I sent out for the study talked about, I guess, my long-term aspirations. That's a long-term. I'm hoping to pursue a PhD, probably in clinical psychology, and then kind of seeing if, like, exactly as you said, video games can be used as an interactive medium to help treat mental health issues.
Well, then we are very similar, because that's pretty much exactly the same thing that I want to do. Is I want to work on creating games that can help treat things like ADHD, depression, bipolar 2 disorder, that kind of stuff. Because I think that it's important to start young with those kind of things, and it's much easier to get a kid interested and invested in a video game than in a therapist.
That's true. Yeah, I think the one special thing about video games, I think that's becoming more apparent throughout the pandemic, especially just because a lot of people have turned to video games as a way to pass the time, their communication style, like community sort of thing. Is that how easily accessible and cheap video games are compared to therapy? By all means, I support therapy. I think everyone should get a therapist. I think it's great for you.
No, we are not shit talking therapists on this. This is therapists are great.
But therapy can be expensive, especially if you don't have the right insurance. And I think video games are so easily accessible, especially towards people who can't necessarily don't have the resources or the environment to work on their mental health.
And some people won't. Like, I've known people that are so deep down a mental health hole that they don't want to get out of bed to go and see a therapist. And like, that could be like a game could be the first step in getting someone a little bit closer to being able to be functional enough to go and see a therapist.
Right.
And I think like that's such an amazing thing. And in psych we talk a lot about preventative care, and being able to have something that kids could use, because we know that like a lot of this times when you're a psych major, you're like, wow, a lot of this stuff is stuff where like you can treat it when you're an adult, but really it's kind of like you missed the cutoff of when it was most treatable, because most of the time these conditions are most effectively treated if you're younger, and you just can't know. And it's something that's, like a lot of regret of like, oh, like if only you could have done it then. And if there were games that were easily accessible that parents could use whether or not their kid had some kind of disorder or something that could be helpful even for people that will end up being or are neurotypical. It could be like a pretty amazing thing to be able to treat that so young and to maybe prevent that from becoming the worst that it could possibly be.
Yeah. Powerful stuff.
Powerful stuff.
I know we're cutting close on the end of our time, and so I usually ask the last question of what is your favorite video game, but I think we talked a little about that in the beginning and like throughout. And so I will ask you instead, as someone who's like thought so much about video games, their uses, their effects on people, if you could share one message to either gamers, non-gamers, parents, therapists, whatever group about video games, what would that be?
Oh God.
Also, take your time if you need. It's a
Yeah.
it's a loaded question.
I think it would be just to broaden your horizons. Really, like there is so much more. It's an entire medium. It's not just one thing. And that's to both people that play video games and to people that are against video games, to parents, to anybody, is that it's a lot more, there's a lot more to it than you think, and there really is something for everyone. Yeah.
Cool. Is there any final thoughts you want to ask me, share with me, etc.?
I mean, I want to ask you, what's your favorite video game?
I think it changes. I think, like, as you said, like growing up, your gaming sense kind of evolves, and also depends on who you hang out with. So in high school, the answer would have been League. Probably through the majority of college would have been League too, because that's how I found most of the community within BU and whatnot. But I think most recently it's been Stardew Valley.
Oh my God, I haven't played it, and everybody's been telling me to play it. They're like, you'd love it so much.
I think you would like it a lot.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, a lot of people have told me to play that game. Yeah. It changed a lot for me too. In middle school, I would have said Minecraft. That would have been my favorite game. And I mean, that's still up there for me, man.
It's a good game.
It's a good game.
It's a great game.
That's still definitely up there, but yeah, it definitely does change as you get older. Stardew Valley. I'm gonna have to play it now.
I put like air quotes. It's also an indie game because it's made like by one person. I don't think he expected it to blow up so much. But
yeah, well, that's kind of how it always is because those games, like a lot of the like games that are indie, they don't get a lot of people playing them until they do, and then it's just like, what am I supposed to do? I'm one person, and it's like, okay, like you guys can get another game, but it's gonna take me 8 years because I'm an individual. Like with Amori, it was, announced, and then it took 7 years for him to finish it. You gotta play that game, man. You have to play it.
I will write that down.
OMORI. It's an RPG horror game, but not really.
Not a huge fan of horror, but I'll do my best.
Oh my God, it's pixels. You'll be fine. It's little pixels.
I will keep that in mind. But thank you for joining me today. I learned a lot. I hope the audience learned a lot.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wish you best of luck in the rest of your semester, and I'll talk to you soon.